the most influential foreign policy figures in our country's history has died. Henry Kissinger, a powerful figure in politics who visited East Texas almost 40 years ago.
We also have pictures from the event.
Within the UT Tyler archives are these photos and other documents from Henry Kissinger's visit to Tyler in September 1987.
Communications in here, fact sheet about UT Tyler that was given to Henry Kissinger.
School leaders brought Kissinger to town to speak as a part of their Distinguished Lecturer series. This letter indicates so many people wanted to hear him speak that they had to move venues from the University Center to Tyler's Caldwell Auditorium.
Foreign policy has to reflect the continuing values of the American people.
After escaping Nazi Germany in childhood, Kissinger became a U.S. citizen and returned to his homeland as a U.S. soldier in World War II. He went on to become one of the most powerful figures in politics during the Nixon administration, eventually serving as National Security Advisor while also being the Secretary of State.
A highly unique moment in American history, because basically there what you are is you're both responsible for the formulation of U.S. policy, but also its implementation.
Watergate led to Nixon's resignation, but Kissinger stayed on as Secretary of State under President Ford, leaving office in 1977. He continued to advise presidents for years to come and remained a powerful figure in politics, attracting big crowds at speaking events like the one in the 80s in Tyler. A man with a legacy as enduring as it is controversial.
Kissinger really did embody a foreign policy approach that sort of disregarded questions of ideals for the understanding of power as the exercise of one's influence.
He's helped us, frankly, resolve a lot of situations internationally that could have gotten worse, and he's helped us avoid those. So I hope Americans will pause and reflect on the impact, the positive impact that he had on foreign policy and the number of lives that he saved, not just American soldiers' lives, but lives across this world as a result of those diplomatic efforts.
And when it comes to that 1987 visit to Tyler, Kissinger is still considered to be one of the most high-profile guests to be featured as one of UT Tyler's distinguished speakers.